pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to the midweek special through a Scottish prism. Lovely to have you here with us. Got another interesting show for you, I hope, today. It's all part of this. We have to understand that after independence, Scotland's got a world it's going to enter, and we need to understand better that world that we're getting into. And there's no bigger event at the moment going on in the world than what's happening in the Ukraine. And I think it's, we've been getting one version of it off of the Western media. And just the same as when we're doing all our stuff for independence, we know that when the BBC are talking to us, or STV or ITV or Channel 4 or the Daily Mail's writing to the record, we know we're not getting told the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's this and more when it comes to the Ukraine. And we hope today, with my guests, that we'll be able to cast a bit of light for some people who maybe don't know the full ins and outs, and we'll get an update on exactly where we are at in that terrible conflict. And for those of you who followed me for a while, I'm an anti-war man. I'm opposed to wars and would love to see an immediate ceasefire tomorrow, although I'm sadly thinking it's a bit off yet. But anyway, without further ado, let me introduce my guests. You'll remember John Corrin from before, a couple of weeks back, when we were talking about multipolarity, and John Moran's here with me again today. John, thank you for coming back. How are you, my friend?
My pleasure, Roddy. Great to be back with the Scots audience.
Oh, they love having you here. Always good to have our Irish cousins with us. And we've gone for a good old double from Ireland. We're also joined by a PhD in social worker, an anti-war activist, Dr. Finbar Markey.
Hi, Roddy. Hi, Hazel. Hi, John. How are you guys?
Oh, good.
Good, great to have you. Thanks for being here, Finbar.
Thanks for the invite. It's my first time on a Scottish platform. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, we're looking forward to it more. Trust me on that one. I've called this show, actually, we give our names of our podcasts every week. Every show we do a wee different name to sort of cover it. And when I was getting asked today, what do you want to call this show this week, Roy? And I come up with the title, John, Is Ukraine the United States Suez Canal Moment? And by that, I'm referring to those who are not as old as me, that the Brits and the French tried to seize the Suez Canal in 1952, 53, or 55, maybe, I can't remember the exact date, but the Americans pulled their chain, and it really told the French and the British that the days of the British Empire and the French Empire were over, and there was a new kid in town. And that's why I've likened this, John. Is this the US's Suez moment?
Yes, I think that's a very good analogy, all right, Roddy. The British were at the height of their powers and they overstretched. Unfortunately, after the Second World War, they were broke. And prior to that, they had been struggling a little bit. They had been coming down as a world power. But Suez Canal overreach was just too much for them. And that was the end of it. I have no doubt that it's a similar situation for the Americans here. And it'll be a second time around for their British allies. But it is the case. This is a huge, monumental error by the Americans who, in my view, were pursuing profit rather than using their brains.
There's nothing unusual in that one with them. Finbar, the fact is, people are maybe listening and saying, what do you mean America, US? This has not been made clear. This war was made in Washington. It's a US proxy war, is it not?
It is, absolutely. Just in terms of your comparison to Suez, I think that's quite a minimalist comparison, to be honest with you. What's happening at the moment has brought us to the brink of world war. It's divided the world into three quarters against the West and the West. It has fundamentally reframed global economics. And it's not going back to where we were. We are never going back to where we were. So in terms of this context, I believe it to be graver that even the Bay of Pigs and the movement of, or potential movement of nuclear weapons over to Cuba in the late 50s. It's graver than that. We have a situation in Ukraine where up to 300,000 fighters on the Ukrainian side have been killed in just over 1 year. 300,000 living souls. That didn't happen in Suez. That didn't happen in Cuba. We have a situation where there are elements in the United States government that not only, as you correctly say, nurtured and created this conflict over the last 15 years, but are also trying to do so as the next step with China. This is far graver than any Suez Canal crisis in the past, in my mind. In terms of the origins and the involvement of the United States, as soon as the Soviet Union fell, which they had a very strong hand in, as soon as the Soviet Union fell, elements within what is currently described as the deep state in the United States were planning this because they wanted to carve Russia up. Russia is the source of the wealth of the world in many ways. It has the oil, it has the gas, it has the food, it has most of the minerals, or whether even if you have to go over eastwards towards Mongolia, it has most of the minerals. And the United States didn't just want a bit of it, it wants all of it. And they behave like gangsters. You do business with them and we're going to burn you down. That's the way they behave. In 2012/13, the Ukraine was in an economic crisis. It needed a major loan. And they looked towards the Europeans and towards the Russians and negotiated with both. The Europeans and the Americans, via the IMF, offered them pittance. What they offered them was actually an insult compared to what they actually needed. The Russians not only offered them what they needed, but offered them free oil and gas and whatever way that they could help. And so the current president at the time went with the Russian deal. As soon as he did that, we had protests that were formulated and created by organizations backed by American dollars. Some of them were linked to George Soros, some of them directly linked to the CIA via certain organizations that distribute CIA money. These protests occurred and they focused on funding Nazi groups in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has always had a Nazi history, but they decided they had to get the madmen who would be willing to bring this to the end. So they funded the Nazis, just like in the Mideast, they funded the Islamic extremists, the ones that were most likely to go militant, to bring this to the end, that were willing to kill civilians, willing to kill members of the government. That's who they funded. So America from the very beginning has been in this. At the time of the Maidan so-called revolution that happened in 2013, we had people like Senator McCain over there driving and orchestrating what was going on the streets publicly in Kiev. We had Victoria Nuland doing the same. So from the very beginning, the US has been involved in this, and this has been a 25-year plan and strategy in the making, and you're damn right, it's falling apart from them.
Johan, it's quite ridiculous that the Americans are trying to sell this as they're defending democracy. And as Finbar's pointed out, they destroyed the democracy in the Ukraine.
Yes, they did. I mean, they had a sovereignty just before the Americans came and they lost it. It's now American sovereignty. That's what they have. And that's a terrible situation to be in. Young Zelensky has no say in what's going on. It's an American game throughout, and they call the shots. Zelensky does not. He presents the PR job, and he seems like a nice, cuddly little man and all of that. But it's a whole PR job. The whole servant of the people shtick is all false. They serve one side of the people in Ukraine. That is the non-Russian speaking side, the Ukrainian speaking side. And that's the terrible shame of it. The Russian side are getting hammered. Their religion, their language. I mean, what more can you do? If that was happening in any other country, the UN would be having a no-fly zone and they'd intervene. Indeed, if you remember back in Libya, they sought a no-fly zone over Benghazi, and it was used by NATO to bomb the whole of the country back to the Stone Age, which is why there will never be a no-fly zone again, unless it's 100% agreed, because we all know what it means.
Finbar referred, John, to the 300,000 Ukrainians who died. And we've talked about the Nazi element in Ukraine, but the Western media doesn't talk about that. It doesn't mention these massive casualties. And it doesn't mention the corruption and the Banderas and the Azov. And this is a fascist country or a fascist government that has been backed by the West.
Oh, it is. And unfortunately, that impulse has always been there. In the First World War, before the Nazis even were invented, some 50 to 100,000 Jews were murdered during that war. In the Second World War, 1.5 million Jews were murdered in Ukraine. I mean, that is more than just a slight fad that's going around. This is ingrained. There
And
is
it
a
wasn't the
hatred.
Germans that did that killing.
No, it wasn't. It was, well, some of it was the Germans, but it was also the Banderaites.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example how ridiculous the newspaper world is about the whole thing, and the political world. We had recently the foreign minister of Israel came to Ukraine, to Kiev, and visited the Babi Yar site there, where in 1941, 33,000 Jews were murdered on that site. And worse than that, the road that leads to the site is called Stepan Bandera Avenue. Its name was changed to reflect the group who had carried out the killings with the Nazis. Now, if the Israeli foreign minister has no problem with that, to me, there's something rotten in the state of Denmark.
For sure.
Because, and this has key implications, because, for example, how can anyone ever be accused of anti-Semitism again while rampant Nazism is allowed to proceed in Ukraine?
And if you're from the UK or the US, your tax dollars and pounds are helping to fund it and fund and keep these people in place. Finbar, we get told again by the Western media that Russia's on the verge of collapse, that Putin's hated, that the war's Crimea will be Ukraine's by the end of the summer. Some people are believing that. It's a load of nonsense.
Yeah, I think there is criticism of Putin in Russia, no doubt about it. But the criticism is that he's been too soft as he went into Ukraine. So when we look at the beginning of, and there was a reason why it was called a special military operation, because its purpose was not to seize land. Its purpose was not to seize Ukraine, to overthrow Ukraine's government. Its purpose had a very specific outcome in mind, and the outcome was that the people of Eastern Ukraine, former Eastern Ukraine, would not be massacred. That's what this was about. We see a situation where in February 2022, January, February, and even before that, there was a massive increase of bombing in East Ukraine, which is all Russian speakers, mainly and Russian cultured. And when we know that the intentions of the Ukrainian regime and the intentions of all these groups like the Azov, who were the ones that were doing it, like the Adair, all these Nazi, highly armed Nazi groups armed by the West, their intention was to commit genocide, to clear out living space. And that's the language that they were using, to clear out living space from East Ukraine. And that meant wiping out the Russians, moving them or killing them. That's what it meant, the Russian civilians. So Putin has a great support at home, and that's quite obvious from the Telegram channels and that if you watch them. And it's quite easy. It just takes an extra step. If you want to get a Russian newspaper, Russian Telegram channel, you can read it yourself. Google Translate is really good. And you can actually go and find out yourself. You don't have to depend on layers of filtering and interpretation these days. I've done it. John has done it. And what I've discovered is the only criticism that I can really find of Putin from people who have access to social media outside of Russia and inside who are Russian, the only criticism is he wasn't tough enough, because he tried to avoid civilian casualties. He tried to avoid destruction in the original planning. And he felt that the Ukrainians would go to the negotiating table. I think that he was even shocked, a little bit like Stalin was shocked the way Hitler turned on him. I think Putin was shocked that they didn't come to the negotiating table. They weren't allowed to come to the negotiating table. One of your favorite prime ministers, I'm sure, Boris Johnson, there was a peace deal almost done, maybe 3-4 months into the special military operation organized in Turkey. Boris Johnson flew over that evening to Kiev when Zelensky came home and told him, do not sign that deal. We'll give you all the arms to succeed. We'll give you all the money you need. Don't sign that peace deal. That peace deal wasn't signed. But in terms of where Russia's at now, Russia has the resources. Russia has the capacity for production now and into the future that the West does not have and never has had. So all the talk from the media, I just find it amazing that they can print the story today. 2 days from now, they'll print a story that totally contradicts the story they printed today. And there's no apology. There's no even attempt to fit it into their broken up jigsaw of propaganda. They just continue to just every day something new. Example, the Phantom of Kiev, this fighter that was supposed to have shot down so many jets turned out to be rubbish. The woman who took down a jet with a tin of pickles or a glass jar of pickles turned out to be absolute rubbish. More serious lies about propaganda. For example, the allegations that the Russian army was using sexual violence as a means of obtaining their ends, that Russian wives were encouraging their husbands to rape Ukrainian women and children. This was put out by the Human Rights Commissioner of Ukraine, a woman called Lubika Denisova. When international organizations said, oh my God, that's awful what the Russians are doing, can we come and meet the victims? That's when her lies started to fall apart, to the extent that it was internationally so embarrassing that the Duma, or the parliament in Kiev, actually had her publicly fired. Even though they could still continue to repeat the lies that she put out there, it was such an embarrassment for them, even though they're telling lies themselves, that they had her fired. When you see this level of propaganda and exaggeration, you know they're losing. You know they're losing, and the other side are winning.
If I might say there, you know, when they Lyudmila Denisova, the former ombudswoman, it was she who brought out these lies. But in the end, she said, well, look, we needed money and weapons. So that was the deal. She'd say anything to get money and weapons. And that's something that I think people should remember. I mean, I don't blame them for seeking weapons. I do blame them for using the kind of ways and means and the lies and all that to get them. You know, but again, we tend to forget it's the most corrupt country in Europe. And what happens in corrupt countries? Lies. Truth is not valued. It's what you can get with what you say. And that's the kind of world we're in when we're dealing with Ukraine and their spokespeople.
Yeah. The thing is about this, about the raping story that was put out, it wasn't the first time we've seen it. I can remember, I had seen them, the posters from the First World War, where it was the Germans that were raping the Belgian women. The Second World, it's always the same.
In Libya, they were saying that Gaddafi was giving out Viagra to all of his soldiers. So this is, but when you consider for a minute what they're actually doing when they do that, they're belittling genuine victims of sexual abuse.
Yeah.
They are trying to poke us in the most sensitive, emotional, and even spiritual parts of our hearts with lies and deceit so that we will hate an entire nation of people. That's what they're actually doing. To my mind, I'm not a religious person, but to my mind, it's wicked almost to the point of evil. When you actually, like Denisova, the detail that she went into about these sexual abuse cases, the graphic detail, what kind of a mind must those lies have come from? To be able to sit down and think up the most horrific things and go into graphic details about sexual abuse of children that didn't actually happen. There's something sick about it in my mind.
Absolutely. But one myth, let me get out of the way, John, is that, as I say, this war started in February last year. It goes back to 2014 when there was the overthrow, the American-backed CIA overthrow of the legitimate government of Ukraine. And then there was the Donbass, Lugansk and Donetsk, correct me if I'm wrong, they voted in referendums to stay as autonomous independent republics within Ukraine. And the answer from Kiev was they started invading, bombing, and attacking the civilian population of those two republics. Is that correct?
It is, but it goes back a little further again, Roddy. It goes back to 2004 with the Colour Revolution, and that failed. But they did it again in 2014, and this time they had all the NGOs from the US and the UK who were in there to prepare the place for what was about to take place. That was the difference. 2014, unfortunately, was very difficult because the EU offered Yanukovych, the president, a deal that would be seen as below the reconstruction deal they did with Greece, for example. And of course, Yanukovych said, hang on a second, we might be able to get something better from Russia. And that's what he was trying to do. Piggy in the middle, trying to find some form of way out of this particular thing without violence. Well, unfortunately, it didn't work out because violence was part of it from the beginning. The guys who ended up in the Nazi battalions many of them had previously been ultras, soccer ultras, who fought on the grounds of football matches over there in Ukraine. And they were taken in by one of the oligarchs over there, the same guy that paid for Zelensky and for his TV program and for pushing that line. I can't think of his name at the moment. But there were all these characters around. You have to realize that Ukraine is a country of oligarchs. Each different province has its own powerful leader, and they decide what goes on. And they're still there. Now they're going to lose out as Russia increasingly takes more ground, but there are powerful figures in themselves.
Now, the thing, Finbar, I think you were talking about Vladimir Putin getting criticism for not being hard enough. But is it not a fact that he views the Ukrainians as fellow Slavs and just thought, if we can topple, I suppose he was looking for regime change, perhaps. Maybe that was his option. I don't profess to know his motives, but he thought that maybe this would be enough to get rid of this government, or at least get them to pay attention to the Russian-speaking ethnic people in the East. And that was why he wasn't so violent, shall I say, for want of a better word, at the beginning. Would that be a fair assessment?
I will agree to that. But I think if you look at Russian MO and military operations overall, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere in Syria and other places, they always begin by trying to do it the nice way, the least damaging and the least destructive way. And sometimes there's no choice but to get a bit tougher. But in terms of the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians, it's so strong. And it's important to remember that Ukraine, a part of Ukraine, the west of Ukraine was actually Poland, the south was Romania, and the east was Russia. And so by going into Donbass, for instance, why to Russian speakers, people who actually then voted to become a part of Russia later on, why would he want to harm them in the first place? You know what I mean? Whereas the objective of the Ukrainian Kiev regime was to do as much harm as possible to those people. It's important to remember that Putin has been on the world stage longer than any other leader, any other major leader. And he knows the impact of public relations, and he understands the concept of human rights. And he plays a good game of chess. So he's not going to go in gung-ho violently anyway, irrespective of what the former relationship or historical relationship between the Ukrainian people and the Russians are. He wouldn't have done that anyway when you look at his MO. And he's big into negotiation. He's big into creating peace through business. And that's what he's about, and that's what his party is about. But he was left with no choice in this instance. But I do agree with you. One of the many reasons that the military operation was not aggressive at the beginning was the fact of the historical association between Ukraine and Russia. But I think there's a plethora of other reasons as well.
Yeah, Sean, just to get us up to date just now, we've spoken about how the Western media are still pushing this myth that somehow Ukraine can defeat Russia. I mean, I think it's like saying Honduras could beat the USA. Is that? I mean, Ukraine, they are brave soldiers. They're dying, and I personally, if I could make a ceasefire happen tomorrow, just now, I would do it. I would stop recording and do it. The killing's going on. How bad is it? An update today from your sources and what you've heard, where we are today with the actual war?
I've put together a small piece here just on what's happening lately. Over the past few hours, a lot is happening, especially around Bakhmut. Now, according to the military summary channel, Russian forces have captured the eastern Bakhmut town of Kromova and are now in the process of encircling Bakhmut into a cauldron. Should they succeed, this will mark the beginning of the end for the Ukrainian garrison there. In the city itself, Russians are now closing in on the last 5 areas of Bakhmut city that are now controlled by the Ukrainian army. The collapse of the city could be imminent as heavy air bombardments now compound the daily grind of Russian artillery, mortars, and heavy machine gun rounds on the city's last holdouts. The introduction of the FAB 500 kg and FAB 1500 kg bombs from aircraft are new to the conflict and are happening because during the many rocket attacks across Ukraine, air defenses were particularly sought out. So with most of these air defenses gone, Russia is now more free to use its air power. The largest bomb, the 7,100 kilogram father of all bombs, or FAOB, has not yet been used. The FAB series bombs are now being fired at Ukrainian positions all along the front for the first time. In the city center, the Wagners have moved up to the Bakhmut river line. They are also pressing in the west and southwest. And south of Chasiv Yar, Russian forces are attempting to capture high ground to neutralize the height advantage enjoyed by the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar. Meanwhile, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Brigade, has issued a dire warning after reports came in of a wounded Wagner prisoner being summarily executed. Prigozhin announced last night that Wagner would no longer take prisoners in Bakhmut. Some see this as an overreaction, while others see it as part of the psychological warfare that takes place in all wars. Reports coming in suggest some Ukrainian forces have also begun leaving the city. So that's the situation in Bakhmut. It looks like it's falling. They will probably have enough forces to have a holdout there just to delay the fall of the city, because what the Ukrainians are talking about their new offensive, that it's going to be delayed now until mid-May or the latter part of May or early June. So that's a long time, but we can't believe anything anyone says in war, because they might want to say that so that they can have a quick move straight away and they'll be on top of you before you know it. But that's the roundup there from Bakhmut, and it looks pretty grim. There's gains for the Russians all over, and in the Kromovo section, it's not the Wagners who are fighting; it's the ordinary Russian Marines.
Yeah. There is I forget the pronunciation right. Is it Chasnivar? Is the last Chasnivar? But if I'm not mistaken, for those who possibly don't know, once the Ukrainian army pulls back from there, it's actually there's no other defensive points for quite some distance. They're out into the open plains, and they're then at the mercy of the Russian Air Force, missiles, etc., and artillery. There is no cover for them. It could be a slaughter.
It's on a high ground, Chasiv Yar, and that's its big benefit. I mean, it's because of Chasiv Yar that Bakhmut has withstood the assault of the Russians for so long, because it compounds the difficulty they have in getting in there. But as I mentioned in the early report, the Russians are assaulting a ground to the south of Chasiv Yar that's on the same height as Chasiv Yar. And once they have that, Chasiv Yar itself is in trouble.
Yeah. Finbar, again, we're being told by the Western media, the corporate media, that Ukraine will, I don't know, they're going to pull into Moscow in a few months and declare total victory. It's absolute nonsense, and people shouldn't be fooled into believing there is a remote possibility of that happening.
Because this is existential for Russia. The Russians feel that Russia will no longer exist if they lose this war. This is as I said earlier, a plan over 25 years that the US mainly has been driving forward. And the Russians know that they are finished, and their democracy is finished, and their sovereignty is finished if they lose this war. So they're willing to bring it to the end and use all of their resources. Russia's economy is slowly moving towards a genuine war footing. And that, if Russia fully engaged its economy in war, which it has not done so far, their supply capacity, their production capacity is immense. There was 300,000 soldiers called up. These were reservists by the Russians there in August of September. And the West was shocked by this. 300,000 is nothing to the Russians, who can easily call up millions. They were not conscripted. They were reservists who had done their time, had signed up that if needs be, they'd come back. So they haven't even gone near conscription yet. Just in terms of, we were talking about some of the advances by the Russians and some of the tactical changes over the last while. I think it's important to move that sometimes can almost be perceived like a PlayStation game about we moved here, we took here, we did this. But in reality, what our media is not showing us is the video footage, the images and the audios coming from these places. At the moment, Bakhmut looks like Stalingrad in 1945.
Yeah.
Just outside Bakhmut in the fields where the Ukrainians are trying to bring equipment in, and all of their trenches. It's like something from 1916. It's like something from this at the end of this Somme. And there are human beings en masse being encouraged by your government, by my government, by governments across the EU and America to go over there and fight. And they've been told, there's advertisements in social welfare offices in the United States and in train stations in the United States from the official Ukrainian Kiev regime. And they're calling, and there's a picture of a homeless man lying on a bench in these posters. And they're telling people that they get free medical benefits and pay if they go to fight for Ukraine. This is advertising in the United States by the Ukrainian government. This is how desperate they are. And they want to send those men over to die, to be blown apart in conditions that we thought had finished 5 or 6 decades ago, that we would never see again. It's not a football match. It's not a PlayStation game. There are so many real lives being impacted. A lot of people were giving out about Ukrainian refugees. Flooding Europe was the language that was used. And to be honest with you, my heart goes out to them. And my heart goes out to anybody who's been caught up in this situation. Every day, there's 10 to 15 new videos coming out on Telegram from Ukraine of these conscription teams. So there's up to 3,000 conscription teams in Ukraine. And quite often their members are people who are able to give money not to be sent to the front. And they go hunting down, not just young men anymore, between 16 and 60. That's the conscription age now in Ukraine, set out by the Kiev government, endorsed by us. And they're grabbing people off the streets, left, right, and center, who clearly do not want to fight. And I believe that the Ukrainian people are being held captive by the United States and by the EU and by their own regime. They're actually being held captive. Because I've spoken to Ukrainians in Ireland who are afraid to talk. They said, because if I tell you what I really think publicly, there's people over there will harass my family. And I actually believe that they are being held captive by us. And we think that we are actually saving them.
Yeah. Some of the myths that have grown up, John, is that they're saying, these tanks, the big game changers, the Challengers and the Abrams tanks and the Leopard tanks, and there's going to be a 300 on sent. But what they didn't tell people when they were talking about these fantastic weapons that were arriving was the fact that at the start of this war, the Ukrainians had 1,000 tanks of their own. They've been taken out the game by the vast majority of them have either been taken out by the Russians or are inoperable. So these tanks are not going to make any difference to the war. But on the opposite side of that, I was listening to Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a very respected American serviceman who was an advisor to the Pentagon. And he was saying that the Chinese at the moment, who are feeling rather annoyed with America in particular and the West and the EU for rejecting out of hand their peace proposal, they have upgraded apparently all their shells to 155 millimeter. And they have got literally millions of 152 millimeter lying in storehouses. The Russians use 152 millimeter. And he's suggesting that will probably end up with Russia. So they have no problem getting armed. It's the Ukrainians who cannot get enough arms to continue this war for much longer, can they?
But isn't that an extraordinary thing? You know, the great producers in the West can't produce munitions or weapons to deal with this war.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're getting 600 to 800 billion a year in the United States, and yet they still haven't got that aspect sorted out, principally because they've only fought the little people in the wars that they did fight.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the last major war would have been Iraq, and even it was in a very, very poor shape. It had nothing to fight back with. So this is the first time that Western weapons, and you have to say that it's a NATO force that is fighting Russia. There are Ukrainians, yes, but they were trained for 8 years during the Minsk talks. They were being trained for the entire 8 years for the purpose of being brought up to NATO standards for a war with Russia. They had an operation against their own people in the Donbass, which they called an anti-terrorist operation, an ATO, which was done specifically to disrespect the people who didn't want their language disrespected, didn't want their religion killed, and wanted to have their culture respected, which is why they sought to have a separate arrangement, not necessarily independence. They didn't seek that in the beginning at all. They just wanted an arrangement whereby they could look after their affairs in their language. They could do their religious stuff without being annoyed or harassed in any way. But that wasn't good enough.
Finbar, one of the great things about the European Union, they said, one of the great strengths of the European Union was that it had kept the peace in Europe for so long. That was one of its main functions and one of the things you could say about it. With the exception of what happened in the old Yugoslavia, it had done that. But now it's gone full tilt in the last few years, and it's a warmongering organisation. It's going against everything that the EU was meant to be about. It doesn't help. You don't end a war by arming someone, do you?
I think the Ukrainian war serves multiple purposes for certain, what you might call the Atlanticist elements within the EU. So these are the EU who basically follow the bidding of the United States, those elements within it, and see the EU as another state in the United States. Those elements have always been pro-war to a degree, have always been pro having an EU army when the time comes to foist that onto the people of the EU. The people of Ireland have a great pride in our neutrality. We always have. And because we have been an oppressed nation ourselves, and the pressure that's been put on the public in Ireland at the moment to abandon our neutrality and to get involved with what the EU are formulating, which is an EU army. They call it through different processes like PESCO and things like that. But it's an EU army that they're creating at the moment. For the first time, the EU Peace Fund has been used to buy missiles for Ukraine.
Unbelievable.
The Peace Fund has been used to buy missiles. The EU member states, for instance, France, when you look at France's involvement in North Africa, its involvement in Libya in particular and other countries, it has never been for peace. Peace in Europe, maybe, but never for peace in general. What's happening in Ukraine is a boon for the EU Atlanticists because they can say, this is why we need an army. This is why we need to arm up and abandon our national sovereignty and come together as one. So creating, the great Russian bear has always been the enemy of Britain in particular. Go back even before, you can find elements of it in the 17th century, even before Russia had fully formulated. So this is good for them. And peace in Europe only while it's suited.
Yeah, of course, going back to 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, there was American and British armies sent to help the White Russians. So yeah, you're right, and that's the whole thing. My whole life, and although I know I only look in my 20s, I'm in my 7th decade here, and from when I was a baby, it was the big bad Soviets, Reds under the bed, commies, blah, blah, blah. We've been programmed, they've always been bad. And when you actually start looking into it, they don't do much invading. And the new Russia certainly didn't. Whereas our friends across the Atlantic have only had, 18 years of peace, John, in their entire history.
Yes.
They are the danger to world peace, not the Russians or the Chinese.
Yes. They're incontinent with their wars. They're on every continent. But it's a problem we have in the world where you have a unipolar leadership that if they don't get what they want, they will force it upon whoever is not giving it. And that's a system we have been living with up till now that has given us some terrible wars and unnecessary wars. And I think now, with the multipolar world and with other options available, particularly to countries in the global south and the Southeast Asia, that when they start joining China and Russia and Saudi Arabia in particular, it'll be a new world. And it'll be possible for people in Europe to join these things as well, like the EAEU and various other organizations.
It is a changing world, Finbar, and for change doesn't come easy, and it's certainly not coming easy to the Americans. They don't have an off-ramp in this. How the heck are they going to get out of this?
I don't think they are going to get out of it. There's no going back. Okay, so Putin, as an example, when they were planning Nord Stream 1 and 2, originally, the Russians were not too enthusiastic about it. They had just come through a process whereby after the fall of the Soviet Union, their country was raped by foreign oligarchs. It was nearly destroyed. The people of Russia were out begging on the streets for food. That's how bad it had become, because they had a situation where everything that was publicly owned now had to be privatized. And so people were given shares and things. But when things came desperate, they sold their shares for nothing to the oligarchs. We suddenly had full control of Europe with Western interests as well. So in terms of, I've just lost my track of what the question was there again, John.
No, I was just saying that this war seems endless. Is there an off-ramp for the Americans?
Sorry, there's something was happening behind my screen there. There doesn't seem to be an off-ramp to me. As I said, I believe that the neocons that are in power now behind Joe Biden are so desperate that they will go the whole hog, and they're not giving up on this. They'll find some other way to try to manipulate this. They're trying to start a war with China as well at the same time. They've got a window of about 18 months before the next American presidential elections to complete all their nefarious plans, because there's a likelihood that the next president is going to be anti the war in Ukraine, is going to be anti-war with China, and is going to be pro-business. Because I think it's important to remember, we told Putin, you do good business and you can be a part of the global family, the global business family. Putin did good business, really good business. So did the Chinese. The Americans didn't like it. So they started a war with Russia because they don't want equality. They want to be the big boys, the bully boys, the gangsters of this world. And so when they did good business and when they didn't invade other people, it still wasn't good enough. So Europe had great deals with Russia. We had great economic deals for oil, gas, food. We were doing really well with those deals. The Americans didn't like it. They want us to buy their expensive shale gas. That's what a lot of this is about.
But Europe is in big trouble, I have to say. Europe is in very big trouble.
Yeah.
Because with the gas being bought now at 4 to 5 times the price that it used to be bought for, the industry can't just compete anymore. And an awful lot of German industry has fled over to the United States. And people around Europe are very, very annoyed about that. I mean, I was just looking at something today. You know, Mr. Borrell, the grand foreign minister of the EU, who likes to refer to the European garden and the outside as the jungle. I was just looking at that today, and I found out where he got his ideas from. He got them from Victoria Newland's husband, Robert Kagan, in his book, which is about the jungle outside. Now, if you're going to be going to the #1 intellectual spear carrier for the neoconservatives, the arch neoconservatives. But that's where you're at. And if our foreign minister in the EU is reading up on his Robert Kagan, we're in big trouble.
But didn't Borrell this week as well advise that all members of the European Union, their navies should go to the China Sea to keep the sea lanes open? The European Union want to join in this war in Taiwan as well. I mean, are they trying to kill us all?
Again, that's overreach from the European perspective. You know, no European individual, European citizen has been asked about any of this. Europe was the European community, the economic community, and that's what we wanted it to be. We didn't want it to be a world power or fighting wars around the world to impose certain rules on people. So this is it's beyond belief that he came out with that. I can't believe that.
I remember the referendums in Ireland about further EU integration, and one of the key objections and why people wanted no votes was that we felt we would lose our neutrality over time. And we were promised, we voted twice. We voted no the first time, so we were forced to vote again under threat. And we were promised that we would have the opt-outs. But it's clear there's no such thing as an opt-out when you get into the EU. They'll tell you have an opt-out on this or that, but they'll keep pressing the matter in all these nefarious and sneaky ways to make sure that there's no opt-out and that but they got your signature on whatever contract they wanted. You know,
but there's no opt-out even if you're not in. I mean, Serbia has been blackmailed to join in the sanctions and cut their own throat because they get all their gas and energy from Russia. And they're saying, and good luck to them, they're saying no. I mean, there's another discussion that we'll come on to in a minute, which is, you know, this could be the end of the EU. I would just make a comment when you were talking, I'm a pacifist and an anti-warer, but you're talking about EU army. If it meant the US out of Europe and all their bases, I would be inclined to go with it, I've got to be honest, even though I'm opposed to all that sort of stuff. I was noticing, John, that the US have spent more money in Ukraine since last year than they did of 20 years in Afghanistan, and in the entire Vietnam War, they have spent more already in 18 or 15 months, is it?
Yeah.
They really aren't messing about. They're not getting a return on their investment, are they?
Well, I don't know about that, because an awful lot of the money they're spending it on Raytheon stuff. So they're buying it off themselves to give to someone else who they will charge for. And what my feeling is that we mustn't forget that 22 out of the 28 EU countries are also members of NATO. So it's the vast majority, and they're all the powerful countries as well. So essentially, the EU does what NATO wants, which is a very awkward situation to be in. And I can't think of a way out of that. But the EU is in serious, serious trouble right now. Mm-hmm. And the Americans brought us here.
It's quite a worry. I mean, we all know that before this special military operation kicked off, Finbar, I remember reading articles in The Guardian and hearing other articles about how corrupt Ukraine was. It was the most corrupt country in Europe. The right wing, the fascists, the Nazis marching in the streets. And now we're also here, we're arming them to the teeth. But what has come out in this is that about 30% of the weapons never get to the front. And that there's an irony to this, that, you know, the next terrorist attack in America or London or Berlin, they could be getting their own weapons turned against them and used against them. Again, we're not been warned about this in the Western media.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in just what you said there. I think in terms of terrorist attacks, quite often what we find when we get to the number of terrorist attacks on mainland Europe and in the United States is that their origins are not as clear as they seem. And sometimes we are attacking ourselves with a terrorist attacks. But one agency or another within intelligence has trained these guys to do this. Some news came out only last week that 2 of the 9/11 bombers were actually CIA agents. Not necessarily contracted to do this, but they were CIA agents all the same. They had worked with the CIA. So that's that. Europe is buggered in general. just going back to your point about Europe, it's just from an economic point of view, we have inflation where food inflation is up in 40 and 50% quite often. People are not talking about that. They're looking at this 9, 10, 11 baseline inflation rate, when in reality, the lived experience is it's much, much higher than that. This is partly because of the Ukraine war, but it's also partly because of their own policies over the last few years as well. You know, it's hard to tell where this is going, but to my mind, it's not going in the right direction. And there's no sign of anything in Europe or anything in the United States in any way trying to redirect this where it needs to go. Any sense is coming from the East.
Yeah, I mean, I just wish I could impress upon people, John, that this, like everything else in your daily life, do not believe the people who've been lying to you all your life in the Western media sources. And I would encourage people to look at other sources like Telegram, for example. I mean,
Sure.
we're supposed to be, defending democracy, John. And yet, it seems to me there's more democracy in the other side than there is in us. Still, remember that joke, are we the good guys? Because it doesn't appear to me that we are the good guys, are we?
No. I can remember donkeys years ago when I'd be visiting my grandmother down the country and we'd be saying the rosary at night. She'd pray for the conversion of Russia. And now Russia is probably holier than Ireland. So her prayers were answered in one sense. But the situation we're in now it's a strange one. But it's the U.S. State Department and its deep state members of the State Department. You're talking about Nuland and you're talking about Blinken and Sullivan and of course Joe Biden himself. But these are the ones. It is that particular group, and they are supposed to be diplomats, but they're starting the war. You had a ridiculous situation a couple of weeks ago where General Miley, who is chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs, wanted there to be peace talks, but the diplomats didn't want it. So you had the general looking for peace and the diplomats looking for war. So up is down, down is up. We're in a Mad Hatter world. And what it's about is America overextending itself, coming up against reality, and reality will win.
I saw on Telegram, Finbar, it was Vladimir Putin at some press conference talking, and he was saying they're now saying they're going to beat us on the battlefield. So I say to them, come ahead. He said, we haven't even started yet. Now, what the people in the West, and now a lot of people watching this don't understand, is because the Russians haven't done a shock and awe and taken massive amounts of territory, that it's as if something's going wrong with their plan. But it seems to me, from what I'm reading, from what I can gather, everything's going according to their plan. This was never about grabbing territory beyond the Donbass, that is, and to protect that. This is not about going to Kiev and bringing Ukraine under Russian rule, is it?
The Russians are consummate planners, aren't they? And consummate chess players to a degree. And there's a plan A, B, C, D. There's a plan A1, a plan A2, in case that, there's tacticians that have a lot of things worked out. I don't think it worked out for them at the beginning. I think they actually I don't think they realized how far the United States and the EU and the UK were willing to push this in Ukraine. And I think they thought that they would have got a deal. At this stage, in reality, as we've reiterated over and over again, there is no hope for them. I said earlier on, 300,000 conscripted. It's nothing. No, it's not called up. It's nothing compared to what Russia can produce. And I can tell you now, from looking at the channels over the last 12 months, the Russians are impassioned, because what they're hearing from Ukrainian sources in particular is language like to kill Russians, calling all Russians orcs, dehumanizing them. This is what they're doing to them. The passion and the heat is up in the blood of the Russian people, and they will accept, if there was conscription of 1 million, 2 million, they would accept that. And their capacity, as I've said again and again, is endless compared to what we can put into Ukraine.
Yeah, but another thing, Finn Barshall, which we didn't mention, is why they were going easy at the beginning, because it was only during the conflict that it came out via Angela Merkel and ex-President Hollande that the Minsk agreements, the West had not acted in good faith. They were using it as a way to stall, to allow time to train up the Ukrainian army to NATO standards, whereas the Russians had gone in there with the best of intentions, thinking that everyone was negotiating in good faith. And you could see almost the hurt and anger from people like Lavrov and Putin when it became known to them that the West had lied to them during these agreements.
The West have torn up hundreds, if not 1,000 years or more, of etiquette on international diplomacy. They've torn it up, they've thrown it in the bin, and they've peed on it. That's essentially what they have done. Because the Russians, the Chinese, so many players actually believe in honest diplomacy. Because if you lie once, you can't be believed again. And they all understand that. You can't be trusted again. But the guys that are representing, like Borrell, like Blinken, like Biden, they're just consummate liars. They've built up their entire careers through deception, through pathology, and through lying. So I said earlier, there's no rapprochement here, I don't believe. There's no way that the trust that existed in the early noughties is ever going to be rebuilt again.
John, here's another thing that I can't understand. And it's simply this, that everyone and your granny, as we say in Scotland, knows who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. The Germans know. It's their most affects them most. They know it was the Americans. Everyone knows it was the Americans. And yet no one wants to negotiate. No one wants to say what everyone knows. They're allowing the Americans to do this to them and still doing their bidding. Explain that one to me, John.
It's impossible to explain other than that whatever the United States says, they expect to be believed. And they're powerful enough through their media to achieve that for a while. But I don't think it's possible to achieve that for any length of time, because more and more people are coming to the conclusion that this war should end sooner than they seem to want to end it. To have this as a war to weaken or exhaust Russia and to use Ukrainians to do that is sick in the extreme, but that's where we are. But unfortunately, we're being let down by our politicians, we're being let down by our media. So we have a situation now where 50% of the story we don't hear because we're not allowed to read Russian material. And the 50% we do get, we get that from the Ukrainians. Whatever they tell us is fact, which leads to situations like Denisova situation, where Russian wives were telling their husbands to rape Ukrainian women. If anyone for a moment would believe that any woman would ever say that to her husband, they'd have a very poor opinion of who they're talking about.
Yeah. It just does prove the point, though. You can kid some of the people some of the time, John, and that's exactly what's happened. Finbar, all wars eventually have to get down to, dare I quote Churchill, jaw, not war. Sooner or later, this war's got to end now. Does it end by the Russians marching up to the Polish border and taking in Kiev? Is that how it ends? Or is there a peacemaker out there? Can China and Brazil and the BRICS countries or someone come up with a magic wand to get us a peace?
First of all, I don't think the Russians' intention has ever been, nor will it be, to go to the western borders of Ukraine, so the borders with Poland. Don't think that's ever been a plan, and it's never going to be a plan. About 2 to 3 months into this special military operation, a word started to come from the United States that they would have been and are still prepared to conduct and to finance and arm a guerrilla operation against the Russians into the future. So for Russia to go over to the Polish border would be to have a permanence of war, if you want to put it like that. The Russians wanted to ensure the safety and the security of the ethnic Russian people that comprised 30% of the Ukrainian population, and that was under real, genuine danger. So they'll go, I believe, to the Dnieper River They have no point or purpose to go any further. One of their objectives was to dismantle the Ukrainian military and to denazify Ukraine. They dismantled the military last June. So it's all Western military since, And just to make the point as well, there's a lot of soldiers in the West that are young guys. So they're not in their 50s or 60s and retired and went to Ukraine. They're young guys who suddenly left the army, took off that uniform and put on a different uniform, but is still being paid by American dollars. So there's a lot of US troops over there as well. Just to make that point from earlier. But they're not going to the Polish border, to my mind. They'll go to the Dnieper River. They'll fortify that as much as necessary. They'll finally clear up what they can of the military on the other side of the river, and they'll try to come to some negotiated settlement. That's my vision of the most likely settlement.
Just on that final point there, do you think Transnistria or Odessa, the Russians will go there? Because, I mean, after all, Odessa was founded by Catherine the Great, was it not? I mean, it's a great Russian city. Will they go for it?
I think they will. And I think Transnistria, the people of Transnistria are in a very awkward position at the moment where they're geographically placed. I'm surprised that they haven't been overrun already, to be honest with you. In terms of going in there, I think that would be a step too far for the Russians, because they'll have to take territory that would not democratically be aligned with them.
It is amazing.
One point. We're all waiting for this Ukrainian offensive, counteroffensive. But there has been a warning today from an American military source that Russia has the strength right now to go on the offensive if they want to. So I bear that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's still the mud season. Now, the ground needs to form up a wee bit more, and then they'll go. Gentlemen, the clock has beaten us. And when I always start these programs, and I know you guys get your own podcast, you worry that what happens if we run out halfway? Not going to happen. And I feel we don't have enough time. We never have enough time. So we'll have to come back to this, because I think at this moment in time, this is the most pressing problem in the whole of the world. And it needs to get more time devoted to it. And there's so many other things that we can bolt onto this, like the 19 countries that have applied to go into BRICS, the change in polarity of everything. All those things we can get fleshed out. But if for this point, just on the ending of it, John, and the same question to you, Finbar, when John's finished, do you see this as short-term or long-term, this conflict in Ukraine?
The conflict, I don't see it as long-term, but I see a completely different world emerging over the next few years. And I just hope that it can emerge peacefully without a major conflict. That would be my biggest fear by far, because there are people in the United States State Department who would bring the whole thing tumbling down just so that Raytheon shareholders would get their monthly increase.
Finbar, what about you? Short-term, long-term?
Long-term. I think the issue in Ukraine will be short-term. It'll be sorted out to a degree. I think where our eyes should be straining towards over the next 3 to 4 years in terms of conflict and violence is the mainland of the United States.
Yes, I agree.
Real trouble brewing, conflict, civil war type things, cessationist movements developing in the United States in response to all the crap that's been going on over the last while. They're still pushing for China. There's an 18-month window before the next US presidential elections. I believe that the wicked people that are behind Joe Biden at the moment will do everything they can to fulfill their plans and expectations in the next 18 months, because there's no way another president like this is going to get in unless it's fixed or the opponent gets assassinated. I think it's the only way. The civil war, the civil strife coming to the United States, I've heard some whispering of that even internally within the United States. And it's all because of these extremists who want to bring the world to war. And can I just say one final thing to the Scottish audience in terms of Scottish independence and how this plays in with Scottish independence? At the moment, you are in a situation in Scotland where if war worsens, let's say conscription were to start here in the UK, your children your grandchildren will be sent over to die to make billionaires, gun-making billionaires, even wealthier. There's an opportunity for an independent Scotland to say, hold on, not only do we want to be peacemakers, we want to do good business deals with Russia, with China, with Europe, with everybody. And I think small, I'm a big believer, I'm not a nationalist as much as I am a statist. I believe the independent sovereign state is what keeps balance in the world, because there's plurality. I can see a country doing something good over there and it works, I can copy that. I can see a country over there not doing something that's not so good for its people, I won't do that. A plural. But if you've got this macro development of union of nations, like the UK is, especially it was, but it still is a little bit, United States, this developing EU, what you'll find is the sovereignty of the people and the independence to make decisions at a local level are gone. You can't touch your leadership. These people will continue formulating war in the name of the Scottish people as long as they're a part of the UK. So my advocacy towards Scottish independence, one of my arguments would be that you can do great business in a multipolar world, and that Scotland has the opportunity to be a part of creating the new multipolar world that's coming, whether the UK likes it or not.
Great
I
point.
agree that. And I hope that does happen. And I hope we copy our Irish cousins, and we have, and I will certainly working towards it, to have a neutrality in our constitution, a written neutrality that cannot be broken no matter what happens. That'll be my aim. Gentlemen, can I thank you for your time, your knowledge, your expertise, to help us and help someone like myself learn more. And I reserve the right to bring you back again for a further chat. And I hope you've enjoyed being here as well.
Anytime, Roddy. Always a pleasure.
And
I'll leave you with a little Irish phrase, Roddy. Being with a kind latteries, we'll be talking to you again.
I look forward to it. I'll leave you with a wee Scottish phrase. I'll see you in the bar.
Pity we can't.
We'll get to it one day. And
One
to
of
you
these
folks, I say to you, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have, talking to these wonderful guys. If you get any questions, queries, let me know. We'll try best to answer them. We'll come back to this topic very, very soon. But until we see you again, you and yours, please take care.
Bye-bye, guys.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.